So welcome everyone to this talk on painting historic ships. We have with us 4 esteemed members of the Society who specialised in painting historic ships. We have Geoffrey Huband, Geoff Hunt, Mark Myers and Paul Wright. They'll be discussing their work, which will be seen on screen, and how they do it and how they perform and how they reference their material.
Well, I've already been introduced, but anyway, I'm Geoffrey Huband, and today I'm going to be talking to you about narrative in painting. I'd actually better correct that slightly. It sounds quite important. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you about storytelling in painting and my personal experience of it. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to show you about 1.5 minutes of video. The first part of it is the background to a painting, which it shows in some depth how much work has to go into research, or could go into research for a painting, and the rest of it just runs through the pictures that I'm going to talk to you about in some detail, but I will be going through it very quickly because we're limited for time. Okay, the start of that video was really all about this particular image. The painting that is displayed there is the loss of HMS Anson in 1807, and it's something I've been fascinated with since I was about 15 years of age, when I bought a booklet written by a local historian, and this particular subject has been of great interest to me. This was a story of tragedy, it was a story of loss, it was a story of sacrifice, it was a story of love. So it got everything, all the ingredients in this particular story. The captain sadly lost his life and sacrificed it for another person. His best friend found a wife, and a bystander who witnessed the event spent the rest of his life developing life-saving apparatus. And in addition to that, the law of the land was changed. That's the impact that this event actually had at the time. This is a detail of a painting which was a commission, and it's the Belle Poule and HMS Amazon. They were part of a squadron which was cruising off the coast of Africa, and this little detail here is really just to give you an example of what I personally find interesting in storytelling. The picture on the left-hand side obviously shows part of the engagement. It shows the ships. the thing to remember about these engagements was that it wasn't just ships. They're the names that appear in history, but it was the men who actually fought the ships. And they all had their own story to tell. Just one thing that I would point out in this particular painting, in order to get a feeling of sort of dynamism, if you like, into the storytelling, you notice that the figures in the tops here, I never actually paint individual figures. What I do is I paint the shape of a group and I let the figures emerge. So I never know how many figures are going to be there or what's going to happen, but I let it happen in a random kind of way, so it gives a little bit more authenticity to it. This painting here, I just wanted to show two different ways of giving extra information, really. This is a painting of during the War of 1812 of the Java and the Constitution. And in the picture on the far picture here, this shows the sort of quarterdeck of Constitution. And again, I allowed the figures to sort of form themselves into groups, which I think makes it more spontaneous. But the point I was making in this picture was that you can use metaphors to tell a story. And flags are a brilliant metaphor, quite a powerful image. And of course you see the difference between ideologies and loyalties. But also you notice that the mast is falling on HMS Java, the ensign is fluttering down, the sail is fluttering down. It's an indication of defeat. So we're actually telling part of a story there, not the whole thing, but enough for people to ask questions. This is very much nearer to my home. I actually live in Cornwall, and this is the old Penley lifeboat. It was called the W&S, and this is a painting, and I tell this as a story in the painting because basically I knew the motor mechanic. I knew him for most of my life, from about the age of 16 onwards, and he told the story. It was direct from the horse's mouth. So I always wanted to interpret it, and I didn't actually paint the picture until probably about 5 or 6 years ago. But I felt that, again, I needed to be close into the subject. It was a case of this rescue took place. There were a salvage crew on board. They had to be taken off the Warspite. It was feared it would capsize. It was going to run aground on the Cornish shore. And the boat was going up and down about 15 or 20 feet. So trying to capture that moment, it tells part of a story, and there's a much, much bigger story that goes with it. This is a picture that actually took me 40 years to paint. And the reason it took 40 years to paint was because I knew the motor mechanic of the Penley lifeboat, and I became very close friends with him. In fact, I was with him about 3 or 4 days before he passed away. He was motor mechanic on this boat as well, until he retired. As you probably all know, the Penley lifeboat became infamous because it was lost under tragic circumstances. It hit everybody in the community. It hit the village. Everyone was hit by this terrible event that simply shouldn't and couldn't have happened. I remember speaking to the motor mechanic a couple of days after the boat had been lost, and he was there with tears in his eyes, and it wasn't just for the loss of the crew. He said to me, the boat was lost as well. It was as if he'd lost a friend. But as I say, it took me 40 years to paint it because I couldn't bring myself to do it. This picture here, I included that one because I worked in Mazel as an artist. I had a studio there for many, many years, and this was the lifeboat service, the sort of annual celebration of the lifeboat. It showed that it was the centre of the community, along with the choir, and we had a band. The band actually wasn't from Mazel, it was a band from Hale at the time. That painting was completed around 40 years ago. It was completed in the same year that the Solomon Brown was lost. I don't know why I had this sense of urgency to paint it. Who can answer that question? But you can see it was a very large painting, and I literally slapped it together because I observed it, and I think it was on exhibition here in London when the boat was lost. But it was to depict that this is part of another story. The lifeboat was part of a community, and these were the things that made up that community. It's obviously not quite the same now. Another tragedy, very much closer to home as well. This is a depiction of the loss of a fishing boat called the Desire, and she was run down in the latter part of the 1800s. And I show this because this was commissioned. It was one of the most recent commissions that I've done, because it was commissioned by a chap called John Strike. Well, the person who wrote the book about the Anson was Frank Strike, and his grandfather was the man you see hanging from this piece of rope here. He was the only survivor out of a crew of 7 on that boat. And as a family, when the picture was presented to them, some of them actually wept because they realized that without that man surviving, they wouldn't have existed either. So one's very, very conscious of the responsibility that one has to undertake when telling this kind of a story. For many years, I was an avid reader of Alexander Kent. We're still going back a very long time, over 40 years ago. And I read his inspirational books, and I often thought how interesting it would be if I ever had the opportunity to illustrate his books. And you can imagine the surprise that I experienced when, in fact, I had a letter arrive, and it was from Alexander Kent, or Douglas Riemann, as his actual name is, and just a simple letter. It said, "I bought a painting from your studio. How would you like to illustrate my books?" And I knew Douglas then. We had a working relationship, and he died about 10 years ago, and that working relationship continued until that time. I felt I got a great responsibility with some of his pictures because he too personalised his ships. They became characters. They became as real as the people in his stories. And this was, I had to explain, as it were, in one simple statement, what was going on. There was something glorious about the fact that the hero ship, the Hyperion, was sinking, but it had won its last battle. Under the name of Douglas Riemann, he was a prolific writer, and he came up with all sorts of subjects, some of them quite unfamiliar to me, so I had to teach myself pretty rapidly something about aircraft and submarines, neither of which had been in my repertoire at all. And I show these two pictures here. How do you tell a story in one image? Well, you don't. You just sort of say, look, this is the image. You know what it's about. It's about the Battle of the Atlantic. We have a submarine and a flying boat. And I juxtapose the two to make it look reasonably interesting. And the rest is to say to people, well, if you want to know what happened next, come and buy me. This book, The Winged Escort, I get inspiration for all sorts of things. Whilst I knew about the attack on the Bismarck by Swordfish aircraft, it wasn't that actually inspired me. I was sitting watching a film. It was I'm just trying to think, something with the Death Star in it, and I just thought, well, look, this sci-fi thing gave me the clue as to what would be the best way to produce this picture. So inspiration comes from all kinds of sources. Star Wars. I'm obliged to the gentleman down here who's slightly less senile than I am. Okay, thanks. As I said, Douglas always personalised the ships, and he wrote about them as though they were individuals, and sometimes they were slightly unusual. This happened to be a gunboat. And so as you can see, this is the kind of work that one has to do in order to produce a story of that kind. You also have to put it in a location that is going to be convincing, and I'd happened to have not long before come back from Malaysia, and I thought, that's the situation. Let's put it in a Malay setting. It'll look reasonably exotic. This is how these pictures come about. And this, quite simply, is the way it looked as a book jacket. It's quite interesting to see what publishers do with the work that you do for them, because sometimes it improves, sometimes the sort of corroborative effort really does make a difference. Again, this is another picture of trying to tell a story, or at least invite people to ask questions about it. The one over here with Blood and Iron, obviously it's a destroyer and a submarine, which again was something else I wasn't all that familiar with, at least I had become so by this time. And it's melodramatic, dark sky. It sets the atmosphere for the brutality of the Battle of the Atlantic. And people will ask the question, well, how did this come about? What's going on? What happened next? Did the destroyer ram the submarine? Read the book and find out. There's also another way of making a statement. In this picture, I made a statement rather than told a story, and hoped that the statement would be enough for people to ask questions, to want to know more about it. The book was called Battle Cruiser. Battle cruisers were obsolete even at the end of the Second World War. And so I wanted to create for the want of a better word, a kind of iconic image, something that looks solid, brutal, but it was well past its sell-by date. So there was a certain amount of pathos about the actual story. This is really just a preparatory drawing. I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to work on a couple of feature films, and this was the most recent of them. This was Dr. Dolittle, and the initial brief was quite straightforward. They said they just wanted a ship that was a ship from the Middle East. They thought it was sufficiently eccentric for Dr. Dolittle. The difference between doing work like this for a film and producing work in you're just part of a story, you're part of a much bigger group of producing all sorts of things to make the story. In this instance, I just provided a general view. But of course, for the film, they want to know, what does the ship look like from every angle? What are the cabins like? How is it going to be rigged? How do we put it together? So you ended up actually producing designs for the whole ship. They also ask you to produce unusual things, fantasy things really, like a dhow being pursued by an old Victorian battleship, and the dhow is being towed by a whale. Well, there's no reference for that sort of thing, but by this time we got quite used to what the wake of modern submarines look like, so I thought, well, put a tail on it, and we've got a plausible story there. So that was just something different that one was asked to do as part of a group of other people who were storytelling. The director and writer of the feature film, for whom I produced what I thought was a very nice drawing of a Victorian battleship based on HMS Warrior, he said it wasn't menacing enough. So we had to use as a model a French warship, and we made it look as awesome as we possibly could, and he was quite happy with that. So all sorts of things that we get asked to do, and they did actually use those designs in the film. This was one of the most exciting things that I think I'd ever been asked to do. This is the Durmstrang ship from the film Goblet of Fire, Harry Potter film, and the inspiration for the ship, they wanted you to conjure something up, magical and mysterious. The brief was very short. It just said it was an old ship, it creaked and groaned, and that it had a crow's nest, and it emerged from beneath the lock outside Hogwarts School. So I thought of something that I thought was mysterious and exciting, and that was a model in the Prince Hendrik Museum in Rotterdam of a ship of about 1480. And when I first saw it, I was excited by it, and I thought that will be the basis for the model. We had a production designer who was an absolute genius, and he managed to persuade me to push the design to the point of complete fantasy and still make it plausible. And he just had a way of drawing those sort of things out of one. So it was that sort of collaborative effort was very, very satisfying. Next one, please. As I say, they really wanted to know how the ship should be put together. So one had to produce a design for the ship. This was the ship. As you can see, Hogwarts is looming in the background as the ship, just after the ship had surfaced from beneath the lake, and that was its sort of more or less its final incarnation. Oh yes, they also wanted to see how would it look if you were looking down the deck as this ship came to the surface. So you then had to work out what the detail would be on deck of the ship and all the bits and pieces and the detail of it. So yeah, it was a 3-month job. It took quite a long time to do. And this is the final picture. This was the 3-dimensional model that was produced, and it was absolutely beautiful. It was the most wonderful thing. It really was amazing. There were 2 models, one the 3D model, and the other was the computer-generated model. And I took great pleasure in actually seeing that on the screen of the Odeon, Leicester Square. I think it's probably the biggest image I've ever seen of anything that I've ever done, and that was immensely satisfying. Well, that sort of concludes really my little homily about my experience of making stories and being part of making stories. But at the end of it all, I came out of it with 2 very clear messages. One from the author, Douglas Reman, and I asked him, as people who know nothing about writing do, well, how do you write a book? And he said, well, look, there's nothing very clever about it. He said, after I came out of the Navy, after the war, I worked for the River Police. And he said, I had to write reports. And all they wanted in a report were 3 things: time, place, action. And that's stuck in my mind ever since he said it. So whenever I'm painting a picture that I think needs to tell a story, I keep that in my mind. The other thing that was a take-home message for me was the production designer, a man called Stuart Craig, who was quite amazing. And I was asking him probably equally dumb questions about the importance of certain things in film. And he said, well, the thing to realise is the devil is in the detail. And you must always, even if you're producing fantasy ideas or in fantasy films, he said you must keep one foot firmly grounded in reality. Then people will remain convinced with anything else that you want to produce. Thanks very much for listening.
The title of my talk is Nelson Sailing Navy, but hardly any of it is about that, so you can relax. A lot of it is about what Geoffrey was talking about, which is the same history that I share with Mark and Paul. All of us have done book covers. All of us have done series of book covers, in fact. And depending on who you landed with, you finished up with one series or another. You got Douglas Reman, Alexander Kent. I landed up with Patrick O'Brien. That's who I got. Not that Patrick O'Brien, who's more famous in every way, but my Patrick O'Brien was the writer. So back in 1988, this was the opening title from that series. This is Master and Commander, but for various arcane reasons, I jumped into that 13 titles in. So the first one I did was actually the 13th one in the series, but then I backtracked right back to the start and started doing the series from the beginning, of which there turned out to be 20 in the end. A lot of what I'm going to talk about, hopefully, will also be about not just the fact that I'm painting historic subjects, but how I relate to those historic subjects. In other words, quite often, it's because they're places I've been or places I've sailed and all this kind of stuff. So this is HM Brig Sophie in Port Mahon, Minorca. But at the time I did that, I'd never actually been there. I'd sailed in and out of there 4 times since then, so I know it much better now. But I'm relieved to say it does look vaguely like that. So I've got away with that one. Okay. Thanks. This is the way, for me, that entire series of book jackets started out with little tiny thumbnail sketches. The actual sketches are about that big, roughly, approximately. They're just what used to be called scribbles on the backs of envelopes, literally thumbnail sketches. And in them, I didn't actually set out to specifically draw the ideas for any particular covers. I just scribbled thoughts about what life might have been like basically on board vessels of the Royal Navy of that period. And then at a later time, I scribbled down, you can probably see some of them there. I mean, for this one, for example, which we'll come to in just a moment, but not yet, this one there, which I'll draw your attention to, I just scribbled down about to board enemy, and then underneath I scribble post captain, question mark, fortune of war, question mark. Well, if we go to the next one, let's focus on that. That is actually how that finished up. That's the cover for post captain. It turned out not to be anybody boarding anything at all. It was just exercising the guns at sea. I think, yes, I've got time to tell you this story. Because of the odd way that the design was set up, the physical cover design was set up. It was all set up so that there would be a cartouche there which had the title and the author and stuff like that on the left-hand side. So everything that I had to do had to sort of fit round that cartouche. And I thought it would be a brilliant idea to have, you're on board a 38-gun frigate here, which is doing some gunnery exercise. And you would observe, those of you who are sailors, that the wind is coming from the left, but the ship is also rolling to the left, see? Because I thought on a ship that size, at a certain moment in the roll of the ship, if the waves were enough, it would, as it were, roll against the direction of the wind. And I had this is a long time ago, this is 1988 I was doing this. I had a letter from a gentleman in America. I used to get lots of letters from gentlemen in America who said, sir, on my 40-foot yacht, when the wind comes from the left, she'll heel to the right. And I wrote back and I said, the same thing happens on my boat. How spooky. But I pitched in this line about how, I was fortunate enough to have dinner with Captain Papp of the US Coast Guard cutter Eagle, which, as you may be aware, is nothing like a cutter at all, but an enormous 3-masted square rigger. So I put that point to him. I said, what happens on the Eagle? I mean, if she's rolling, would she actually roll against the wind? And he said, yes, she would. She would roll against the wind, but if she did that, she would dump the wind out of the sails at that particular point. So I thought I was half right. So that's about as good as you get these days. Okay, what's this got to do with anything? I'm trying to make these connections between places I've been and seen and things like that. This is the 1977 Silver Jubilee Review at Spithead. I was lucky enough to get a sortie in a helicopter because I was involved with a Maritime magazine at that point. So this painting was done at some time after that, some considerable time after that, from photographs that I'd taken myself, things I'd seen. This is HMS Sheffield. Sheffield was lost in the Falkland Islands a couple of years after that. And if anyone at that point, because my wife and I actually had tea in the wardroom with Sheffield that day, and if anyone had said to you at that point, this ship is going to be at the bottom of the South Atlantic in 2 years, they would have thought you were out of your mind. But that was a Sheffield. So I have a personal connection with that particular Sheffield. Sheffield was brand new then, of course. All the other ships you see in the background have now all gone to the breakers' yard. This is a long time ago. But if you just look at that image and the height you're at, we go to the next one. That sort of engendered a historical painting that I did. I did a whole series after I'd done the Patrick O'Brien book covers. I thought I'd do paintings of the ships that Captain Aubrey, his hero, served in. And I did 2 paintings which summarised all of his ships. So this is kind of the helicopter's eye view, looking out over Spithead, the same sort of thought, but it's also the height of view you get from the topmast or the top gallant mast of ships of that period. You're like 100 feet up. That's the kind of helicopter's eye view. And for those of you who are any Patrick O'Brien readers here? Anyone ever heard of him? Right, okay. This is going to get tough now. That's the Leopard. That's the Ariel. That's the Polycrest, which is this weird sort of double-ended thing that pops up in one. That's the Boadicea, and that is the Ringle there. So they're all vessels that appear in that series. Yeah, good. Okay, next one. Thanks, Ben. the sources of information for us, go back to the original sources. And this is a draft of a 44-gun ship, and by sheer chance I just happen to have it here. These are wonderful objects of art. That is the actual draft. It's a facsimile, same size, from the Maritime Museum. That is that thing that you see there, more or less, rainbow 44-gun ship, 48 scale. So for me, in constructing the historical narrative, I mean, it's a storytelling thing, as Geoffrey was saying, but in doing historical paintings, like the one there, which we will come back to shortly, you go back to the original sources, the logbooks, the written letters, accounts, but also the physical information. And that's the physical information there is for every single ship you're looking at. You go back to the draft and you use that as your source. The rigging is a bit trickier, isn't it, Mark? Because they didn't do rigging diagrams then. What you do is you take the length of the gun deck and the extreme width, and you add them together, and then you divide them by 2, and that is the length of the mainmast. And every other mast, spar, and rope on board one of those ships, there's pages of these things, is a fraction of that length. So, for example, the foremast and everything to do with it is 7/8 of whatever it is your mainmast turned out to be. So, which is fun. You can spend hours and hours and hours doing this if you really want to. You just follow the formulae that they had for deriving rigging. Next one, please, Ben. I showed that draft because that is the basis of this painting. I got commissioned by an American gentleman who wanted me to do anything I like, really, but he was kind of interested in Maine, and I thought it would be interesting to do a scene from the Revolutionary War, War of Independence, and I happened across a story about how Captain Collier took this ship, the 44 we just looked at, HMS Rainbow, up the Sheepscot River in Maine, on a filthy black night when nobody knew where the hell anything was, and if you look at the chart of the Sheepscot River, you wouldn't like to do it in a yacht now, let alone anything else. But I went there. He very kindly shipped me over there, and I scrambled down through the woods to this point here. So that boulder there is completely authentic. I did a gouache drawing of it on the spot, as the pine tree, I think, has changed a little bit since then. And all I had to do was imagine HMS Rainbow the following morning sailing up to the hapless town of Wiscasset, who must have been absolutely stunned when this thing appeared off their shore after such a stormy night that nobody would want to be out in it at all. So that's, stories of places I've been to. Next one, please, Ben. This again is, I got interested in the American Revolutionary War. What do you call it, Patrick? Do you call it the War of Independence or the American Revolutionary War? Whichever one it is, it's that one. Revolutionary War, bless you. Yeah, that thing anyway. The unpleasantness. Yes. And during the course of that war, the Congress decided it was going to build 74 gunships, which is just, an insane idea. Why would you even dream of that in the chaotic conditions that prevailed at the time? And they actually built one of these things. This is the USS America, the first ever American line of battleship, 74-gun ship, which they gave the command of to John Paul Jones, who's apparently a right pain in the arse. I think I'm allowed to say that, aren't I? To the point where John Paul Jones was... This is Portsmouth, New Hampshire. I went there as well, so I know the location. I know what it's like. It hasn't changed much, actually. And John Paul Jones was resident in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, so as to supervise the construction of this ship. But he fell out with the builder to the point where they were only communicating by letter that had to go down to Philadelphia, I think, the Marine Department, and back again. So these guys were neighbours in neighbouring streets, but they weren't speaking to each other. So it's just a bizarre and extraordinary story, but a very attractive ship, which nothing happened to at all because it was given to the French to make up for one that they'd clumsily lost off Boston. I was contacted in 2007 by John Lippiatt, Rear Admiral Lippiatt, who he came here to this show, and he'd just been named as CEO of the Mary Rose Trust, which was tasked with creating the new museum. Anyone been to the Mary Rose Museum? It is fabulous. That's his work. His handiwork was John Lippiatt's work. And so he was looking around this show, and he said, you must come down to the Mary Rose and have a look around. So I said, okay, yeah. So I went down to the museum, which then, of course, was nothing. The museum didn't exist, but they had the remains of the ship roofed over, and they had fans going and brown gunk in the air. You had to have proper respirators to go in there. And he showed me around that, and he showed me all the back collection. And then he took me up to his office, and this is a key point. He said to the secretary, he said, could you get us a couple of cups of coffee? He said, the good coffee, he said. And then he said to me, we chatted a bit more, and he said, what we would like you to do is paint a 24 by 36 inch artist's impression of the Mary Rose, given the latest information we have on it, and donate it to us together with all the print rights. And I said, oh, all right, okay. But it was a fabulous connection, and it was a really, really interesting project to work on. And you'll probably see how interesting it was if we go to the next one, because I'm very proud of this. I did this because this here, as you can probably guess, the colour bit is what survives of the Mary Rose, together with the stem. And all the rest of the greyed bit is bit that I had to recreate from kind of first principles, because for ships of that period, there are no plans. Plans were not drawn, least of all rigging diagrams. So that, that was an ongoing, fascinating exercise to try and develop what these ships actually looked like. Sorry, can we go back one, Ben? Back one. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we only have one named contemporary painting of this ship, which is by Anthony, who was an ordnance officer, but that's a different story. Yep. Okay. Next one, and then again. I include this. This is the flagship of the Portuguese Navy, the Príncipe Real, 84 guns, which brought the Portuguese royal family from Portugal to Rio de Janeiro. I'm not sure how you pronounce it in Portuguese. Somebody can correct me. In 1808, after Napoleon marched into Portugal. This is the most famous painting I've ever done, because it turns out that nobody at the time had ever painted it, and nobody's ever painted it since, this scene. So it's in every school textbook in Portugal and Brazil. A number of times I've been contacted and said, can we use your picture? We can't pay you anything, but can we use the picture? So it's in all the textbooks, because nobody at the time ever bothered to paint this key thing of the Portuguese, the imperial family being shipped over bodily to Rio de Janeiro. There's the Sugarloaf Mountain over there, Príncipe Real. That's what that one is. Ben, go. Yeah. Oh yeah, time to do the Victory. I think I've got a minute or two. That's the painting you see behind you there, because I've painted the Victory lots of times now. This was a recent, very recent painting, which is why it's here, of course. What interested me about this, again, it's finding a little story, which is in the logbook. When Victory was first commissioned, and she'd been built 13 years before this, but there was no need for her because there was no war going on at that time. I think they probably roofed her over, which was standard practice then, and left her on moorings off Chatham with a maintenance crew on board. But 13 years later, they suddenly needed her. War broke out, obviously, so they very quickly commissioned her, rigged her, stored her, put the guns on board, scraped together a crew, and they shifted her down the Medway and anchored her there off Black Stakes It took me about 6 weeks to find out where Black Stakes was, which I did in the end. And at that point, the King George III, visited her. So I thought it's just such a little quirky little story. It'd make a great little picture. So that's the royal yacht, Royal Caroline, which conveyed him, it's only 4 miles or something, from Chatham down to where Victory was moored. And then this is the royal visit. This is him being linked across in his galley with the then royal standard to Victory in all her Georgian glory, because then when she was built, she had double stern galleries and she was covered in carving and gilding, and the sides were varnished, which used to be called bright, and all the rest of this thing. In 1801 to 1803, she was radically rebuilt at a cost greater than the original build, which is why she now doesn't look like that. She looks much more workmanlike and warlike than she looked then. But she was a wonderful piece of Georgiana, then. Another place that I went to, Victory again, of course. Vice Admiral Nelson was commanding the Mediterranean fleet, and he decided he was going to chase Vice Admiral Villeneuve, commanding the French Toulon fleet, all the way across the Atlantic to the West Indies and back again, which he promptly did. So this is actually Victory off Trinidad, off the Dragon's Mouth, where I was lucky enough to go aboard Sea Cloud 2. I was doing a lecture on board. So this is Dragon's Mouth. And I'm pretty sure this is the only time in history that a British first-rate 100-gun ship crossed the Atlantic, because normally those things were just not needed to do that. They were needed at home. They were big, expensive, powerful things which were needed back on this side of the Atlantic. So there we are. That's Victory off Trinidad. Ben. This is, again, we're in the Battle of Trafalgar. This is one of my keynote paintings, which I called Heavyweight Punch, because this is the lead of Victory's line. It's Victory, Temeraire, Neptune, here in a telephoto lens, as you've noticed. So, things are sometimes imaged through my experience of seeing film and TV and all the rest of it. So this is very much a sort of condensed look, but a terrifying thought if you're on the receiving end of this thing. Ben, next one. This, again, this is a rather similar image. This is the other line. This is the leeward line. This is Royal Sovereign, and Victory's line is out there. Battle of Trafalgar once more. And again, this is one of those little tiny stories that you find, and you think that would be an interesting thing. Apparently, what Royal Sovereign did, as she was bearing down, about to cut the enemy line, she fired a forward gun, so that this cloud of smoke would drift down ahead of her and foul up the aim of the enemy gunners, which I hadn't heard of before. But so I thought I'd make quite a nice picture. So that's Royal Sovereign's part in the Battle of Trafalgar. I'm just painting a Battle of Trafalgar now, which is my 18th Battle of Trafalgar. Then. Final one. Oh, the final one, yeah. But there was still Battle of Trafalgar again. This is obviously the moment everyone knows about. This is Victory crossing the stern of the Bucentaure, crossing the T, and doing this thing of firing this devastating broadside into the stern of the French flagship. But there again, I like the idea that what you would have seen had you been in one of the Franco-Spanish ships here would have been Victory, but veiled in this great cloud of gun smoke coming towards you, because the wind would have been drifting it down towards you. So you'd have had this sort of, terrifying apparition appearing through the smoke, with sort of fire and flame and all the rest of it. And people don't realise, I think, that if you're just reading an account of those battles, and you're trying to figure out what was going on, half the time they couldn't work out what was going on, because once you'd fired a couple of broadsides of black powder guns, there was so much smoke nobody could see anything. So that was kind of that image, and I think we are. Look at that pinpoint timing. Ben, thank you very much. That is me done. Thank you. Thanks.
This is really where it all kicked off for me. My dad was a Pan Am pilot, and when I was 7, we ended up there for 3 years. And so I was introduced to the joys of British education, learning how to do long division in pounds, shillings, and pence. But the big thrill for me was we were going across Hong Kong Harbor all the time, and to see the junks and sampans working their sailing ships, engineless, carrying cargo all over the place. Now, of course, it's a historic subject because all of that commercial stuff is long gone. But as a 7-year-old, 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old, it really excited me. Okay, change. When we got back to San Francisco, where our family came from, this just knocked my socks off. They just restored the Balclutha, a big steel Cape Horner. The sight of that and going on board and gazing aloft was what really got me going with sailing ships. Also, the museum that restored her put up with me very patiently over many years, and the staff there were kind and helpful. Anyway, we can go on from that slide to try to make myself useful in the museum, and so I could draw things and help them out with displays, that kind of thing. The director was a fellow called Carl Cortum, who had been in the ship that's a model of, which is the last American Cape Horn ship, and he also was in her for the last cargo carrying passage from Washington State to Cape Town in 1941. The joy of that museum was learning everything. The library was open to me, but also the old boys, the old salts that would hang around in the office. And they could look at my little drawings and tell me where I was going wrong or suggest things, that sort of thing. It was a first-class education. Next slide. There wasn't all that much on the West Coast. There was Balclutha, the Store of India in San Diego, but you had to go to the East Coast, to Patrick's Hangar, to see other ships. That's the Constitution in the Boston Navy Yard when I could manage to get across the country and have a look. Then there was Mystic Seaport with Charles W. Morgan, Joseph Conrad. Again, staff kind and helpful. Next slide, please. And on one of these trips, I think it was 64, they had a gathering called Operation Sail, which was like the tall ships race. Big square riggers from, and before and after, from all over the place, all around the world, gathered in New York Harbor and did a parade of sail here and there. And again, I could make myself useful by running groceries and mail out to the ships and helping in the office and this and that. And by good fortune, I managed to wangle a passage in the Sagres. That's the first time I'd been in a ship like that under sail. But that fed this need to understand these things better and better. And the only problem was to work in one of these things, to sail in them, you had to be a member of somebody's Navy or Coast Guard or in a merchant marine academy. How would you do it otherwise? But there I was very, very lucky because I was corresponding since I was in high school to a guy called Captain Alan Villiers in Oxford, who was a go-to guy for people who had a replica or wanted to make a film with old ships. And Alan was very kind and helpful, and he gave me my first berth in sailing ships.
Very famous man, but very famous.
He was. Next one, please. So this is, I think when I was 19, I started working in these vessels. These are film ships in Hawaii, a Yankee whaler and a missionary brigantine, and it was in her that I got to know people who had been at Villiers would pick crews from the old days that he knew as a nucleus, but he was quite encouraging for younger people like myself. And so you learned loads. Plus, you just learned how to handle these things. Next slide. This was the real deal. This is the thing that I wanted to do most. When you do that sort of thing, people look at the paintings with all the rigging and things and think that's the hardest part. But it's the easiest, because when you've done it, you know what it all goes, what it all does. I must say that it was, it's just where I wanted to be and what I wanted to do. Next slide. And after that, another ship, I was going through university. When I got a degree, I ended up in Appledore, and with this beautiful little replica, the Nonsuch, 17th century replica of the ship that founded the Hudson Bay Company's fortunes in 1670. So I was in her a couple of years as bosun and mate, and again, we're learning a lot. So that's really, I won't go on and on about this. We'll show you a little bit of painting and stuff later on. Could you change there we go. When I started exhibiting, I ended up in a lot of shows in San Francisco and Seattle to do with the early history of the Pacific Northwest, the days of exploration by the Russians, the Spanish, the English then, or British, and the French, believe it or not. And how I would approach it was to go always to the logbooks and journals that people who'd done it had written themselves. So you were seeing it through the eyes, basically you're just reading what they're writing down as they're looking at it. And occasionally, well, quite often actually, something just jumps off the page, like this thing. This is the Russian naval captain Lisiansky in the Neva, who just turned up in Sitka Sound in Alaska at a time when the local Russian governor was trying to recapture a fort that the Tlingit people had destroyed a couple of years before, to get his ships across Sitka Sound on a calm day. They just lashed the ship to God knows how many skin kayaks and bidarkas that had come about 1,000 miles paddled down from the Aleutians to gather in Sitka to help the Russians retake this fort. How could you not paint it? It's Gulliver, basically. It's Gulliver's sort of travels in reality. Next slide, please. Some of these paintings of exploration are easier to do. Some voyages are well recorded artistically, and Captain Cook had a voyage auras. Vancouver had very competent people in the ships that would draw what was going on. But like Geoff was showing, this is Vancouver's Discovery, of which the Admiralty did a couple of plans to show the alterations they wanted to make to the ship. But of course, there's nothing about the rigging. But it's, like Geoff said, it's possible to go back to rigging tables or to the dimensions of the ship. Just make modifications based on comments that Vancouver made to come up with sort of the real deal, the whole works. Next, please. Most of these West Coast discovery and exploration voyages, you don't have the luxury of that sort of stuff. This is a Spanish chart. It's kind of typical of, if you can find references to these little ships, it would be in this form. It's a little vessel called the Sonora, and she's only about 40 feet long. But she was going to Alaska on voyages of discovery for the Spanish. Next slide. I'm going to take a little time to go through another voyage. This is by a fellow called James Colnett, who had been with Cook in Cook's voyage, and then came back as the leader of a 2-ship expedition with the Prince of Wales, the large ship on the right, and a little cutter called the Princess Royal, that were very early participants in the fur trade. Cook's people discovered that if you got furs from sea otter skins from the West Coast, the Chinese would pay handsomely for them, and it inspired a succession of voyages to cash in on this. So Colnett, bless him, would make little sketches in his journals. They were never published when I was trying to get into this. I knew how significant and extensive his voyage was, but you had to go to what is now the National Archives and look at their microfilm to see what he did and where he went. And you got little sketches like that. Colnett would also draw the birds and fish and little bits of native culture. It was wonderful stuff, but there was a lot of it. Could we have the next one? This is one of Colnett. Well, this is the big thing is the Prince of Wales having a problem on the rocks in some little corner of Alaska, which he managed to get off. The ship was 30 years old then anyway, and they did very well to manage to repair that thing and get it away. Could you change the slide? To try to get a handle on that Prince of Wales, there's no plan or anything like that, but the way I work is to start with basic information. She does appear in Lloyd's register, so you know she's 252 tons. She was built on the Thames, and you know what her draft of water was. Then you just search and search and search until you can find vessels of the same period, the same date, if you can, same place of build. You can find very similar things. It's educated guesswork. It's not the last word, but it's as close as I think you can get to reconstructing what she looks like. Next slide, please. And so you can put it all together and carry on from there. The next important bit in painting these scenes, exploration scenes, if you've got the subjects, if you've got the incidents from the log and all that, it's the location. And for me, it was always important to actually get there. Alaska is possible in a lot of ways. There's a ferry service that runs all the way from about Seattle out to the Aleutians, to Dutch Harbor, because there's so many islands, the coast is so cut up, there's no point in road work, so a lot of the other states would pile money into freeways and stuff like that. Alaska got a damn good ferry service that covers all these little isolated communities. Plus, you meet people that are interested in the history and all that, and they have boats, or you get friendly with the fishermen, and so you can go to isolated little coves where nobody lives particular, but you can get there. When you're there, you can get the 360 of what it's like. You can reconstruct, if you know from the logs where they anchored, blah, 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 then you know what they saw. You know exactly what they were looking at. Plus you've got the weather, you've got the light, you've got a lot of things that you can recreate. And this would apply to all kinds of voyages of discovery. I'm dealing with the Northwest because I've done a lot of it. But next slide, please. Then you got, with that sort of stuff, a string of native cultures from the Inuit up in the Arctic, all the way down to the Tlingit, the Haida, Shimian, Kwakiutl, Kosale. There's dozens of individual tribes, and they all have very individual styles of some of the basic materials in the clothing are the same, but the patterns are different. It's a wood-based culture, so their tools and implements are all wooden pretty much. but they are distinctive, one little tribe to another. It all handed down from father to son. And the same, could you change the slide? The same with the canoes. They built fantastic dugout canoes, 60 feet long, with and seaworthy things. They could go all over the place in these. This is a very archaic, just drawings of an archaic form of canoe they call a head canoe, which, from different places. Some of these models were collected on early voyages. There are carvers today that can build these things, and artists who maintain the tradition. Could you change the slide? I fell in with a guy called Bill Holman, who wrote like a seminal work on interpreting what everything means on the coast. And he also built canoes. He was a professor at the University of Washington, but he's an honorary member of the Quaquutles. So I could go out with Bill on, this is a 35-foot dugout that he built himself, and used to get a gang to help him tear around Puget Sound in it. But just to get a feel for how these handle and what it's like to go in them. Could you change? This is the end of the talk, but it's how it all goes together. It's how it's a place called Port Stewart in Alaska, not far from Ketchikan, where all the cruise ships go, with a reception by George Vancouver on the discovery of some of the more important chiefs in the district, and each one of the chiefs would have their distinctive round gowns and robes and talking sticks, weapons, that sort of thing. Anyway, I won't keep you guys going any longer, but thank you for your presence. That's everything.
I'd like to start with the inspiration behind the work that I do, and I believe the work that all the artists in the society do as well, if I may presume that. Given that the gestation period of interest, I think, for Mark, is certainly took some time because of quite a lot of research. And it took me one afternoon, an event that I will clearly remember. I was 10 years old at the time. I'm now 76. But I was 10 years old at the time, and we had at our school history trips. And one of the children was very lucky to have, as a father, the Chief of Naval Affairs in Portsmouth. So he got us a trip to Portsmouth Harbour and the Navy. First off, we were taken to the Victory. Okay, the Victory, and I do appreciate the Victory now, is a wonderful relic. But for children, it's too old, right? Children like modern things. They like to see things which they can experience. And that was the same for us. Then we were taken on a boat with believe it or not, the guide had one arm and one eye. Yeah. And he said, don't look at anything you see. Don't look at it. It's all secret. And we passed by a whole line of warships being in various ways of being refueled or whatever, or loaded with ammunition. Don't look at that. And off we sailed to the Solent, and there in the middle of the Solent, an azure sky, totally reflected in the sea, and HMS Vanguard, the last British battleship, and also the biggest. Now, can you imagine what that did for a 10-year-old boy? It looked like a block of flats, right? When I walked up the ladder up to the deck, by the time I got to the top, I'd burst into tears. 10 years old, okay, I accept that. But I was so moved by the sheer scale of this thing. We went inside the turrets, saw how the ammunition was brought up, all the brass inside it. Fascinating for a child. I stood at the bow of the ship, looking back, and at that moment, the whole ship, and in fact every battleship, belonged to me. And I believe that is possibly the same for Mark and for the two Geoffs as well. Their particular subject is an emotional one, as well as a technical exercise in paint. Could I have the first? Now, I started out, like all my colleagues here, as an illustrator, and I still am. And in fact, excuse me while I pick something up. I started out as an illustrator. I still am an illustrator, but mainly working for Osprey Publications. And we have the pleasure of one of the editors here listening to us as well. There she is, Una. Now, I love working for these people because the subject interests me. I love the subject, and it's once again steel ships in various historical contexts. This one was one of my first book jackets, and it brings me to another point of reference for the maritime artist, and that is being influenced by other maritime artists. And in this case, I was influenced, certainly in the sky and the sea, by a man called Frank H. Mason. He may well have been a member of the society, and we need a historical perspective on that. But he was a famous British maritime artist. My grandfather had a print of his, and it looked like that, except for the ship. The ship is a slightly older one than he illustrated. Can I have the next picture? But also, although it says iron and steel, I spent a lot of time illustrating sail and wood. Douglas Freeman, Dudley Pope, and Patrick O'Brien. I started the first ones, the ones that Geoff missed, and then did them. Now, I did find that Geoff knew much more about sailing ships and wooden Nelsonic ships than I did. And it needed the amount and depth of knowledge that he has to get a thing like that right. I think that's not too bad, but it does need an enormous amount of expertise. Now, the other thing about these type of ships, which I do like, is the fact that when they are in action, they're close together. And you see the actual action between and the relationship between the two ships. With steel, it means that your ship is way on the horizon and you can't see it. So you can only ever see one ship firing its guns and imagining that there's an enemy out there somewhere. Go to the next picture, please. Right. Also, as I think Mark has certainly shown, we've got to go to places or get the actual features of the place right. I was very lucky in this case because my first trip to New York City, I actually saw that scene, except of course not the ships, which are rather old, but it was a British petroleum calendar about famous ports and how they started. And obviously in New York, the Brooklyn Bridge is the big major element as far as the sea and linking Brooklyn with the rest of Manhattan. If we could go to the next one. An English port this time, same series, but this is Liverpool. So once again, I wanted to bring figures in this case to show a sense of scale, but also the fact that these things carry people. They're not just inanimate objects that float about on the sea. They are actually there for a purpose, and so there are some of the people possibly waiting to be transported somewhere. If you have the next one. Titanic, well, I did that at the time, the anniversary of the Titanic, and it was exhibited here. Once again, it's just a fantastic ship. There's not an awful lot we now don't know about the Titanic. So I think that's enough, and we can go to the next one. Now, here's an American ship. This is the Johnson, right? Now, what happened with the Johnson is possibly, and I'm going stretching out a limb here, is possibly the most fantastic, heroic action that ever took place between battles at the sea. And in fact, this was the Battle of Samar, which was part of the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Pacific War. And what we have here is a whole Japanese fleet that surprised the Americans. It shouldn't have done, but it did. And it was very, very large Japanese warships. And what was faced was a few little destroyers, Fletcher-class destroyers, that charged into battle against the Japanese fleet. Now, a fantastic action, and this particular ship, USS Johnson, was crewed and very well crewed and disciplined by Commander Evans. His name was Commander Evans. He was actually a Cherokee Indian, which was the main for the name. It doesn't sound Cherokee, but the other thing was the fact that given, the social disparities and things in America at that time, he rose to the rank of captain, and he told his crew that he would fight to the death when he was asked to go into battle. And that is exactly what he did. He was lost with his ship. The crew survived, but he put up such a brave fight that when the Japanese surrounded the sinking ship, the captain of the Japanese destroyers came out on his bridge in full dress uniform and saluted the sailors. And this wasn't done very often between enemies, but it was done in this case. Evans got a Congressional Medal of Honor posthumously, and he has a memorial in Washington. Next one, please. This is HMS Lion, one of our battle cruisers in the First World War. Very nearly blew up at Jutland, but managed to survive. If we can carry on. Right, now, this takes me to another point that I'd like to make, and that is what we can learn, again, I'm repeating myself slightly here, about positions and situations from other maritime artists. And I learned an awful lot when I started show here from Chris Mager, and so did Geoff. I think you'd admit that. Yep. He was a very nice man, very modest, and tremendously talented. And he could show, what he showed was, you don't have to just show a ship on the sea, you can be on board a ship, right? And that's the exciting thing. You're there, yeah? And so I've put that, and I think that makes it, to be honest with you, makes it a more effective situation. And there we are, same sort of thing again. Same ship, that's the Barham. Sadly, she went down. I'd like to just touch on a moment of history here. That another thing that I'm really, really keen on is hearing from people who either survived or certainly witnessed history. I think it's fantastic. I feel close to the situation. I had a student. His grandfather was a stoker on board the Barham. The Barham was struck by 5 torpedoes in the Mediterranean, and as she turns over, the famous film of her going up, blowing to pieces. His grandfather managed to get off the ship. And for a stoker, that was bloody, amazing. 800 men were lost. It was a terrible loss of life, but he managed to get away. And if he hadn't got away, I wouldn't have been talking to that student, because he wouldn't have existed. And that, to me, if you go, next one, please. Right. Now, once again, here's another bit of history, and it's melancholy. Right? I think and we've got to bring in these elements into our paintings. This is HMS Good Hope before she went off to Coronel in the First World War and was destroyed by Admiral von Spee. Admiral von Spee had much bigger ships, much more modern, and he knew that he was going to his death. But he was sent there, and Winston Churchill, who was in charge of the Admiralty then, said, you must go down and you must face them and you must sink them. And of course, typical Churchillian stuff. And he did his duty. And he went out there knowing that he wasn't going to win, and he was lost along with that ship and the other cruiser that went with him. So the terribly tragic story, and I wanted to build a sense of melancholy and history into that picture. Next one. There she is, in fact, being destroyed by, and that was done for a book jacket as well. Okay, next, please. Once again, a First World War subject, and also we're on board. So there we have, some men crouching down there, another man doing something there, and so on, and a very, very choppy sea. Once again, it's composition again. We've got to make the sense that, oh my God, we're feeling not very well on board that ship because she's really pitching around. Okay, next one, please. Now, here's another history lesson I got. This is a Bismarck, pretty obviously, for those of you that know about these things. And I got a phone call. I have a colleague or friend, Ian Ballantyne, who is the editor of Warship International, and he had introduced me to a man who was 96 years old, and he was on the telephone to me, and as a 17-year-old boy, he served in HMS Rodney, and Rodney more or less destroyed the Bismarck with her guns. It went right up close to her and blew the hell out of her. He was a 17-year-old boy on the bridge of this huge battleship. And I said, God, what was that like? He said it was both terrible and tremendous. He said the noise was unspeakable. He said it was terrible to see the German sailors being blown up into the air because of the British ship. And it was also, a 17-year-old, it was tremendously exciting as well. Frightening, but exciting. And at the moment that this was happening, the chaplain appeared on the bridge and begged the captain to stop firing because of the carnage that was being created. And the captain turned to him and said, leave the bridge, chaplain. Your place is not here. This is our work. Full stop. And it's chilling, isn't it? Yes? But that's how the Navy won its battles. Ruthless. And a complete, there's no humanity there at all. But she was a danger and she was sunk. Could I have the next one? A special subject for me. Once again, Mark had a special interest in some of the ships around that part of America, Seattle and so on. I have a pretty big interest in Japanese Navy, right? when I first started showing at the RSMA, I wouldn't have been able to show that, because there were lots of guys who had served in the war. Worsley, who was the president at the time, of course, he'd been in a German prisoner of war camp. In other words, there were lots of people to whom that would have been an affront because of the Burma and all the horrors and so on that happened then. Now, of course, those people have faded away, and I can show what I think is a very interesting type of ship. And the Japanese invented so many different forms of warship, including the greatest battleship which ever sailed the sea. And their cruisers, everybody learned from these cruisers. The next one, please. Now, there's another element, I think, which we all have to think about in terms of appreciation and as artists. And this is a SMS Seydlitz, a German battle cruiser in the First World War. Well, she was very famous in the First World War, a hero ship. She lost an awful lot of men in the Dogger Bank battle and Jutland. But she also led the German ships to surrender, and it was where she really belonged, as at the head of their navy. But this is an element which I think that we all have, and that is, and one which we've not mentioned, and that is love. Right? Now, what is that woman doing, standing there? She is literally saying to her husband, who is this character on top, waving at her, right? He's saying, left hand down a bit, bring her in, this way. In other words, she was always there to help birth her and her husband's beloved battle cruiser. And that's what they called it, beloved battle cruiser. They were in love with this ship. Now, well, you say, what's this got to do with, the First World War and a warship? Because a warship can be an image of love. And I ask you, all of you here, to look at all the paintings in this room, and they'll all have an element of love in them. A love for subject matter, of knowledge that is brought into the subject, and a love of skill and painting. But it's there, and no painting would be worth anything without that. Yeah? Now, this is a very obvious one about love, and it's the love of these two people to their ship. And the captain, Moritz von Egedy, and his wife, the crew knew all about this kind of love affair they were having. And they really, really loved their ship as well. Could I have the next picture, please? Right, now, I suppose what I'm saying is I've done other things besides warships, but this is a painting which painted itself. The subject matter literally was all there whilst I was in a New York street, and there, one of the buildings, I'm afraid, is the Trump Tower, which was not called the Trump Tower in 1986, thank God. Anyway, it's there. This is basically, it's saying that New York, in those days, was not an Italian or an Irish city, but a black city. Very much so. So we have mainly black people there. It also, the taxi happened to be literally stopped there, and it says, please don't forget. And there is a gay element you can see in the middle of the painting, and in those days, AIDS was rife in that city. And so basically the whole picture, and it came together, it painted itself, as it were, to say, do be careful. Now, when it says, please don't forget on top of the taxi cab, they're talking about cigarettes. They're talking about, it says, please don't forget that Carlton is lowest. That's in the full thing, yeah? And that was low tar, in other words. But in fact, it seemed to make sense with that picture. and the element and the place and everything else. If you could, next one, please. All right, and this is my final picture, and I have to admit that it's my favorite of all the pictures I've done, anyway. And it's, as a sign on the ship says, it is the Normandy. Now, I'm prepared to stand here and say that I think the French Normandy liner was the most beautiful thing that has ever sailed the seas at any time. I think she was just fabulous. And not just on the outside, but on the inside, all the greatest French designers, painters, artists contributed to her interior. Sonia Delaunay, René Lalique did the lighting system and so on. It was absolutely fantastic. And here she is setting off. There's my grandfather's Citroen car, the one that's green. And it's basically, once again, I take the point of Geoffrey here and talking about narrative. And narrative is tremendously important in our job, I think, anyway. So I think that's it, isn't it? Yes. Well, yeah.